It was a cool Monday morning when Marcus Williams, a black man in his early 30s, walked into his workplace, a large tech corporation headquartered in downtown Atlanta. Marcus had been a software engineer for 8 years and had climbed the corporate ladder with grit and determination. But despite his hard work, he could sense an unspoken bias in the air. Subtle comments, side glances, and moments of exclusion had been a quiet shadow following him throughout his career, but today, things would take a turn for the worse. As Marcus entered the sleek glass building, the receptionist, usually polite and cheerful, seemed unusually cold. "Marcus," she said without looking up, "HR needs to see you before you start your day." His heart skipped a beat. HR meetings rarely brought good news, but he kept his composure. "Sure, thanks," he replied, heading for the elevator. Inside HR, Marcus was greeted by the company's chief officer, Elaine Turner, and his immediate supervisor, Greg Myers. The room's atmosphere was tense. "Marcus, take a seat," Elaine began, her tone firm yet insincere. "There's been a complaint about your conduct." "A complaint?" Marcus asked, confusion evident on his face. "What kind of complaint?" Greg chimed in, his voice dripping with fake concern. "It's been reported that you've been creating a hostile work environment. Multiple employees claim you've been aggressive during team meetings." Marcus blinked, stunned. He prided himself on professionalism and had never raised his voice or been anything less than supportive to his colleagues. "That's not true," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Can you share specifics? Names? Dates? I'd like to address this directly." Elaine and Greg exchanged a glance before Elaine responded, "Unfortunately, we can't disclose the details right now. We're launching an internal investigation, and until then, we'll need you to work from home." Marcus felt the heat rising in his chest, but he kept his cool. "I understand," he said, standing up. "But I won't let this slide. I expect full transparency in this investigation." As he left the office, Marcus knew something deeper was at play. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate attack. It was a cool Monday morning when Marcus Williams, a black man in his early 30s, walked into his workplace, a large tech corporation headquartered in downtown Atlanta. Marcus had been a software engineer for 8 years and had climbed the corporate ladder with grit and determination. But despite his hard work, he could sense an unspoken bias in the air. Subtle comments, side glances, and moments of exclusion had been a quiet shadow following him throughout his career, but today, things would take a turn for the worse. As Marcus entered the sleek glass building, the receptionist, usually polite and cheerful, seemed unusually cold. "Marcus," she said without looking up, "HR needs to see you before you start your day." His heart skipped a beat. HR meetings rarely brought good news, but he kept his composure. "Sure, thanks," he replied, heading for the elevator. Inside HR, Marcus was greeted by the company's chief officer, Elaine Turner, and his immediate supervisor, Greg Myers. The room's atmosphere was tense. "Marcus, take a seat," Elaine began, her tone firm yet insincere. "There's been a complaint about your conduct." "A complaint?" Marcus asked, confusion evident on his face. "What kind of complaint?" Greg chimed in, his voice dripping with fake concern. "It's been reported that you've been creating a hostile work environment. Multiple employees claim you've been aggressive during team meetings." Marcus blinked, stunned. He prided himself on professionalism and had never raised his voice or been anything less than supportive to his colleagues. "That's not true," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Can you share specifics? Names? Dates? I'd like to address this directly." Elaine and Greg exchanged a glance before Elaine responded, "Unfortunately, we can't disclose the details right now. We're launching an internal investigation, and until then, we'll need you to work from home." Marcus felt the heat rising in his chest, but he kept his cool. "I understand," he said, standing up. "But I won't let this slide. I expect full transparency in this investigation." As he left the office, Marcus knew something deeper was at play. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate attack. The crack of gunfire echoed through the coffee shop, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor. Marcus instinctively shielded Rachel as they crouched behind the overturned table. The air was thick with dust and panic, every breath ragged and quick. "We need to move," Marcus whispered urgently, peeking around the edge of the table. Outside, a black SUV idled, its windows tinted. Another round of bullets peppered the shop, forcing him back into cover. Rachel clutched the folder tightly. They don't want this getting out. If they get their hands on this evidence, it's over. Marcus scanned the room. The only exit was a back door near the kitchen. Stay low and follow me, he instructed. The two crawled along the floor, avoiding the shattered glass and broken furniture. A bullet ricocheted off a nearby counter, making Rachel yelp. Marcus grabbed her arm, pulling her closer. Almost there, he assured her. They reached the kitchen, and Marcus pushed open the heavy door, revealing a narrow alley. He checked both directions, his heart pounding. The coast seemed clear. For now, run to the left, he directed. There's a parking garage 2 blocks down. We'll lose them there. Rachel nodded, clutching the folder like her life depended on it. They sprinted through the alley, their footsteps echoing in the night. Behind them, the sound of car doors slamming and footsteps gave chase. The sun had barely risen when Marcus, Lydia, and Rachel arrived at their next destination, a discreet FBI office tucked away in a nondescript building on the edge of the city. The moment they walked through the door, the weight of the situation seemed to press down harder on them. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The walls were lined with confidential files, and the hum of phones and keyboards filled the room as agents moved about, preparing for their next assignments. Wait here, Lydia instructed, stepping forward to speak with the receptionist. After a few moments of hushed conversation, she returned with a grim look on her face. The agent we need to speak to is on his way up. He's been briefed about the situation. Marcus nodded, his mind racing. The evidence they had gathered was solid, but he knew it wasn't enough to take down Greg and Elaine without solid backing. The agents would need to act quickly, and Marcus had a gut feeling that time was running out. Every minute they waited put them all at greater risk. Suddenly, the elevator doors opened, and out stepped a tall, stern-faced man in his late 40s, dressed in a sharp suit. His name was Agent Derek Hayes, and his reputation for handling sensitive investigations was well known in the bureau. He extended a hand to Marcus, his grip firm but not overly warm. I've been briefed, Hayes said, his voice steady. Let's get to work. Lydia handed him the folder with all the gathered evidence, and the agent's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the documents, taking in the gravity of the situation. This is serious, Hayes muttered under his breath. I've dealt with cases like this before, but these people are more connected than I thought. We'll need to move fast. I'll arrange for a secure transport of this evidence to the central office. In the meantime, you three need to lay low. Lay low. Marcus repeated. You don't understand. They're going to come after us. They've already tried. They're dangerous. I know, Hayes replied, his gaze intense. That's why I'm assigning 2 agents to protect you. We'll put a tail on you, but you need to stay out of sight until we can build the case. No social media, no contact with the outside world. The fewer people know where you are, the better. Marcus felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. As much as he appreciated Hayes' plan, the idea of hiding and being hunted made his blood boil. He wasn't the type to run, he never had been. But this time, there was a bigger fight ahead, one that required patience and strategy. All right, but I want to be kept in the loop, Marcus said, his voice unwavering. I want to know what's going on every step of the way. Hayes nodded. You'll be kept informed. I promise you that. The following days were a blur of meetings with FBI agents. Strategizing over the phone with Rachel and Lydia, and preparing for what Marcus knew was going to be a war. Greg and Elaine weren't just petty criminals, they were entrenched in a web of corruption, and bringing them down was going to take more than just a few good witnesses. It was going to take an army. In the meantime, they were holed up in a safe house provided by the FBI, a small but secure cabin in the woods far from the city. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe. Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. Every knock on the door, every rustling of leaves outside, set his nerves on edge. He had been through a lot in his life, but this felt different. This felt personal. One night, after a long day of reviewing more documents and surveillance footage, Marcus sat alone at the small kitchen table, staring out the window at the moonlit woods. The quiet was suffocating, the stillness of the place unnerving. He hadn't been this alone in years, and though he knew it was necessary, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was slipping into a fight he might not come out of unscathed. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine revving broke the silence. Marcus shot up from his chair, his heart racing. It was a distinct noise, something out of place. He grabbed his phone and texted Lydia immediately, "Someone's here." "You hear that?" A minute later, Lydia responded, "We're watching." Stay inside. Marcus didn't wait for any further instructions. He grabbed the handgun the FBI had left for protection and moved to the window, peeking out cautiously. A black sedan rolled slowly up the dirt road leading to the cabin, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Damn it, Marcus muttered under his breath. They found us. He quickly moved to the front door, locking it behind him. His mind was sharp, adrenaline coursing through his veins. This was it, the moment he had been dreading was finally here. The fight was no longer about gathering evidence, it was about survival. Seconds later, the sound of footsteps echoed outside. They were getting closer. Get ready, Marcus whispered to himself. He had no intention of going down without a fight. Outside, the men in the black sedan were moving with precision, their footsteps deliberate and calculated. Two men stepped out, each armed with heavy rifles. They approached the cabin cautiously, knowing that Marcus and his team would be expecting them. Lydia and Rachel were hiding inside the back of the house, watching through a crack in the door. They were ready to make a move if necessary, but they couldn't risk drawing attention to themselves just yet. Marcus had already mapped out his escape plan. The woods behind the cabin were dense and would provide cover. But he wasn't about to leave without a fight. As the door creaked open, Marcus sprang into action. He fired off a warning shot, and one of the men dropped to the ground, clutching his shoulder. The other man reacted instantly, returning fire. The cabin became a battleground. The exchange of gunfire inside the cabin was deafening as Marcus dove behind the kitchen counter, narrowly avoiding the barrage of bullets that splintered the wood and ricocheted off the walls. The men outside weren't just hired thugs, they were professionals, trained for situations exactly like this. Marcus could hear their voices shouting to each other as they moved around the house, trying to corner him. Keep moving. Don't give him a chance to breathe. One of the men shouted. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he adjusted his grip on the handgun. Every shot needed to count. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Peering over the counter, Marcus fired a shot at the silhouette of one of the men creeping around to the front of the house. The bullet struck its target, sending the man stumbling back in pain, but there was no time to savor the small victory. The second man was already moving through the back door. Marcus needed to think quickly. Lydia. Rachel. Marcus shouted. His voice was calm, but urgent. Get out of here now. Lydia, ever the quick thinker, grabbed Rachel's arm and pulled her toward the back window. They weren't in any position to escape through the front door, the attackers had it covered. The back window was their best shot. Just as they were about to climb out, the door to the cabin suddenly crashed open. The second man had entered. Where do you think you're going? The man growled, his voice cold and merciless. Without hesitation, Marcus fired again, hitting the man in the legs. The thug dropped to the floor with a howl of pain, but he was far from finished. You'll regret this, Marcus. The man hissed through gritted teeth. Marcus wasn't waiting for another round of threats. He grabbed a duffel bag lying by the door and stuffed it with supplies. He didn't know how much longer the FBI team could keep up their efforts, or if they even knew the full scale of what was happening. All he knew was that the longer he stayed in one place, the more dangerous it became. His only chance now was to escape, regroup, and stay alive long enough to bring Greg and Elaine to justice. Outside, Lydia and Rachel were running as fast as they could. The shadows of the trees blurring around them. The distant rumble of engines made their blood run cold. We need to find shelter, fast. Lydia said, breathless, pulling Rachel to the side to avoid being seen. Rachel's fear was palpable. What if they catch us? What if Marcus? Stop, Lydia said sharply. Marcus can take care of himself. We need to focus. We'll be okay if we stay hidden. Rachel nodded, wiping her forehead. The air in the woods was thick, but the cold was biting. They couldn't afford to stop for long. Ahead of them, Lydia spotted a rundown cabin, just the kind of place they'd been hoping for. No one would expect them to hide there. It was abandoned, and if they were lucky, it would stay that way. We'll wait there, Lydia said, pointing ahead. As they neared the cabin, Lydia turned to Rachel. Get in and stay low. If they find us, we're dead. Understand? Rachel nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. The woods were eerily quiet, but Lydia's words made the air feel thicker. Back at the cabin, Marcus had barely finished packing his bag when the unmistakable sound of tires on dirt reached his ears. 2 SUVs. More reinforcements. He moved quickly, grabbing his handgun and heading to the back exit. The moment he stepped outside, the old wooden stairs creaked underfoot, betraying his position. He dropped to the ground, quickly scanning the area for a way out. But his cover was blown. As he crouched low, he heard one of the men call out, "I know you're out there, Marcus. We're going to find you." The game had changed. This wasn't just about escaping, it was about survival. Marcus sprinted into the woods, adrenaline pumping. His heart hammered in his chest, but his mind was sharp, calculating every move. He needed to keep ahead of them. He had to get out of this alive. As he ran through the trees, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Lydia's name flashed on the screen. He answered quickly, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Lydia, what's going on?" "Marcus, they've found us." Lydia's voice was full of urgency. "We're at the old cabin. We can't stay here much longer." "Where are you?" "I'm heading your way, but I'm being followed," Marcus replied. "I'll draw them off. Just get ready to move when I tell you." "I'm not leaving without you," Lydia said. "You hear me?" Marcus clenched his jaw. "Just stay hidden. I'll be there." He ended the call just as the sound of footsteps behind him grew louder. He wasn't sure how many were chasing him, but he knew he couldn't outrun them forever. He needed to lead them away from Lydia and Rachel. As Lydia and Rachel hid in the abandoned cabin, the air was thick with tension. Lydia paced, checking the time on her phone. "He should have been here by now," she muttered, biting her lip. "Something's wrong." Rachel gripped her arm. "Don't worry. He's tough. He'll be fine." Lydia turned to her, trying to ignore the fear gnawing at her own gut. "I hope you're right." Outside, the sound of distant vehicles could be heard. Their pursuers were getting closer. Marcus was running out of time. The men were closing in, and he was still too far from the cabin. He needed to do something drastic. Without thinking, he dove into a small creek, praying it would throw off their scent. He crawled along the bank, keeping low, and waited for the men to pass. His heart raced as he listened to their footsteps growing louder. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. Lydia's message blinked on the screen, "We're ready to move." "Where are you?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, then texted back, "Stay put. I'll be there soon." The woods were dense, the moonlight barely filtering through the thick canopy above as Marcus maneuvered silently through the trees. His body ached, every muscle screaming for rest, but there was no time for that. He needed to make sure the attackers lost his trail. He had to make it to Lydia and Rachel before it was too late. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel road told him the SUVs were still searching, and they were close. He'd gone off the beaten path, keeping his movements unpredictable. His ears were sharp, listening for any sounds that might indicate they were catching up. Sweat dripped down his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he refused to stop. His phone buzzed in his pocket again. It was Lydia's message, "Hurry, Marcus." His heart skipped a beat. He knew they were relying on him. There was no way he was going to let them down now. With every step, the distance between him and his pursuers narrowed. He needed a plan. A distraction. Something to slow them down. His eyes scanned the area, landing on an old abandoned barn about 100 yards away. It was dilapidated and barely standing, but if he could make it there, it might give him the cover he needed. He gritted his teeth and ran, his feet pounding the ground as he pushed his body harder than he ever had before. Behind him, he could hear the unmistakable sound of boots crunching through the underbrush. He wasn't alone anymore. They had found his trail. Marcus ducked into the barn just as the first flashlights appeared from between the trees. He pushed the door open and hid behind a stack of wooden crates, his breath shallow and quick. He wasn't sure how many men were out there, but he could hear their voices, low and urgent. He went this way. "Keep looking," one of them growled. "Stay sharp," another voice said. "He's good at this. We can't underestimate him." Marcus clenched his fists, his mind racing. He needed to create a diversion, something that would buy him enough time to get to the cabin. As he moved deeper into the barn, he spotted an old fuel canister in the corner, next to a rusted generator. His eyes narrowed. This could work. Lydia was pacing in the abandoned cabin, the walls closing in on her as the sound of distant engines echoed through the woods. Rachel sat quietly in the corner, her face pale, hands wringing nervously in her lap. "We can't just sit here, Lydia," Rachel said, breaking the tense silence. "We need to get out. Now." Lydia's gaze snapped to her. "I know, but if Marcus doesn't make it here soon, we'll have to find another way." Just then, Lydia's phone buzzed. She grabbed it, her pulse quickening as she read the message, "Almost there." "Don't move," a breath of relief escaped her. At least Marcus was still coming. That's it, Lydia said, glancing out the window. We wait for him. We have to trust he knows what he's doing. But even as she said the words, a nagging doubt settled in her stomach. What if they were running out of time? What if the men had already found the cabin? They couldn't afford to wait much longer. Back in the barn, Marcus was crouched behind the crates, carefully pouring fuel from the canister onto the floor. His plan was simple, cause enough of a distraction to force the men to pull back, give him a chance to slip away. He didn't want to burn the whole forest down, just enough to buy some time. He glanced back toward the entrance of the barn. The men were getting closer. If he was caught in here, there would be no way out. His hands shook as he set the canister down and grabbed a lighter from his bag. His breath was steady, calm even, despite the chaos around him. This had to work. The lighter flicked, and he held it to the fuel-soaked floor. The flame caught immediately, and within seconds, the barn was alight with a roaring fire. The smell of burning wood and fuel filled the air, and Marcus ducked low, sprinting toward the back exit as the flames licked at the walls. Outside, the men yelled in confusion, not expecting the sudden eruption of fire. It worked. Their attention was diverted long enough for Marcus to slip into the trees, leaving the fire and smoke behind him. The sound of the fire echoed through the woods as Marcus continued his flight. The smoke billowed high, casting an eerie glow over the forest. But he couldn't stop to look back. Every second he wasted could mean the difference between life and death. His phone buzzed in his pocket again. It was Lydia. We're ready. Are you close? Marcus didn't waste time replying. He pushed forward, knowing that he was getting closer to the cabin. But the fire had created a chaotic distraction, and with it, the noise of his escape had likely drawn the attention of more enemies. He could hear them, more voices, coming from the opposite side of the woods. They were organizing, regrouping, preparing for the next phase of the hunt. Marcus couldn't let them catch him, inside the cabin. Lydia's nerves were frayed. She paced back and forth, clutching her phone, waiting for a sign, any sign that Marcus was nearby. Rachel stood at the window, scanning the tree line, eyes wide with fear. It's too quiet, Rachel whispered, almost to herself. Stay alert, Lydia ordered. Marcus will get here. Suddenly, the sound of crackling branches reached their ears. Both women froze, listening. The door to the cabin suddenly burst open, and Marcus stumbled in, breathless but unharmed. He slammed the door shut behind him. I made it, he gasped, his voice rough from the run. We need to go. Now. Lydia wasted no time. She grabbed Rachel's arm and headed for the back exit. Marcus was already ahead of them. Scanning the perimeter. We're not safe here, Marcus said urgently. We have to move. As the trio moved quickly through the woods, the tension in the air thickened. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig seemed louder than it should have been. They had no idea how close the men were or how much time they had left. But Marcus knew one thing for sure, this was just the beginning. The fire had bought them some time, but they couldn't afford to slow down. The fight was far from over, and if they were going to survive, they needed to stay one step ahead. The men in the forest were no longer just chasing them, they were hunting them. The trio pressed onward through the dense woods, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves covering the ground. Every sense was heightened, every rustle in the bushes, every distant shout, every snap of a twig seemed like a potential threat. Marcus led the way, his mind sharp and calculating, eyes constantly darting to the tree line. Lydia and Rachel followed closely behind, each of them on edge but trusting Marcus to get them to safety. The fire had done its job, distracting the pursuers and buying them a few precious minutes. But Marcus knew the clock was ticking. They were still far from being safe, and the forest was no sanctuary. The men would be regrouping and organizing their search. And once they realized what had happened, they'd escalate their efforts. We're almost there, Marcus said quietly, barely breaking the silence as he glanced over his shoulder at Lydia and Rachel. There's an old house just ahead. It should be abandoned. Rachel nodded but couldn't hide the nervousness in her eyes. How much farther? Not far, Marcus assured her, though his voice betrayed a slight edge of uncertainty. He didn't have a clear plan beyond the next few minutes. All he knew was that they needed a defensible position, somewhere they could regroup and reassess their next move. The old house was a risk, but it was their best option right now. Ahead, through the trees. The outline of the house appeared. It was a dilapidated structure, likely abandoned for years, but it offered potential cover. Marcus sped up, signaling for Lydia and Rachel to follow closely. As they approached the house, the sound of distant engines reached their ears, the thundering rumble of vehicles coming their way. Marcus didn't have to look back to know they were being hunted. The men had regrouped, and they were closing in. Move faster. Marcus hissed, pushing them toward the door of the house. He yanked it open, the rusted hinges creaking loudly in protest. The interior was dark, but at least it was a refuge, at least for the moment. Once inside, they moved quickly, scanning the place for any signs of life. The house was abandoned, its furniture covered in dust, windows boarded up. It was clear no one had lived here for years, but it was the perfect hiding place. Lydia and Rachel immediately went to the far corner, where the broken window offered a view of the road. Marcus took a few steps inside, checking the perimeter. The house was large, but it seemed structurally sound, at least for now. There was no sign of anyone else being here recently, but that didn't mean they were safe. Stay here, Marcus said to Lydia and Rachel, his voice low but firm. I'm going to check the surrounding area. Lydia opened her mouth to protest, but Marcus was already moving toward the back door. He had to ensure they were safe. He couldn't afford any surprises, especially not when they were so close to their goal. Outside, the sounds of approaching vehicles grew louder. The men had arrived. Marcus moved swiftly, staying in the shadows, blending in with the darkness as he positioned himself behind a thick tree near the edge of the property. He could hear the screech of tires as the SUV skidded to a halt. We know you're here, Marcus. One of the men shouted from the road. His voice was unmistakable. Greg, the ruthless enforcer who had been hunting him from the start. Marcus gritted his teeth. He was close, so close, but the danger was still very real. They had him cornered. The men spread out, fanning through the trees. Their voices were low, but there was an undercurrent of urgency. They weren't just searching for Marcus, they were closing in for the kill. Split up. He can't hide forever, Greg barked. Marcus's heart raced as he considered his next move. He had to make them think he was still inside the house. He needed them to make a mistake. Inside the house, Lydia was growing increasingly restless. What's taking him so long? She whispered to Rachel. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, her senses on high alert. She could feel the tension building, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Rachel didn't reply at first, her face pale as she stared out the window, eyes tracking the movement of the men. They're getting closer, she murmured. We can't stay here. Lydia took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. Marcus knows what he's doing. We just need to stay quiet, stay calm. But as the minutes stretched on, doubt began to creep into Lydia's mind. Where was Marcus? What if something had happened to him? Outside, Marcus was still moving quietly, his mind working at full capacity. He needed a diversion, something to pull the men away from the house. The element of surprise was his only advantage. He crept up to the side of the barn near the house, keeping low to the ground. There was a stack of old firewood behind it, and the rusted barrels scattered around the yard gave him an idea. He carefully positioned himself behind one of the barrels and set the small explosive he'd picked up earlier. It wasn't enough to cause a massive blast, but it would create enough of a distraction to throw the men off his trail for a few precious seconds. The fuse was lit, and Marcus sprinted for cover. He dove behind the barn as the small explosion went off with a thunderous crack. The shockwave shook the ground, and the sound echoed through the woods. The men instantly went on high alert, shouting to each other as they scrambled to find cover. Marcus didn't waste any time. He bolted toward the house, knowing the distraction wouldn't last long. He had to reach Lydia and Rachel before they were caught. Inside, Lydia and Rachel heard the explosion. It was louder than anything they had expected, and for a moment, they froze, fear seizing them both. What the hell was that? Lydia whispered, her heart pounding. It's Marcus, Rachel said with a gasp. He's making his move. Lydia grabbed her phone, ready to send him a message, but just as she did, the back door of the house creaked open, and Marcus slipped inside, his face grim but determined. We're not safe here, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We have to move, now. Lydia nodded without hesitation. It was clear they were running out of time. The air was thick with tension as Marcus, Lydia, and Rachel moved swiftly through the darkened house. The explosion had bought them a few precious moments, but they knew it wouldn't last long. The men outside were regrouping, and they would be coming for them. Marcus could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. This was the final push, the moment when everything could either fall apart or fall into place. We can't stay here, Marcus said, his voice urgent but steady. The only way out is through the back. If we stick together and keep moving, we might just make it. Lydia nodded without hesitation, her hand gripping Rachel's arm tightly. The fear in Rachel's eyes was palpable. But Lydia knew she had to stay strong. They were all relying on Marcus, and if he said they needed to move, then move they would. The back door of the house creaked open, and Marcus peered through the crack, checking for any sign of movement. The moonlight cast long shadows over the yard, but the coast seemed clear. "For now, go," he whispered, signaling for them to follow. "I'll lead the way." They moved quietly through the yard, each step calculated, each breath held. But even in the silence, Marcus could hear the distant hum of engines. The men were close. They weren't going to let them slip away. As they reached the tree line, Marcus signaled for them to stop. He peered into the distance, trying to gauge how much time they had before the men would be on them. His pulse raced. They couldn't outrun the SUVs, not on foot. But if they could reach the main road ahead, they might be able to signal for help. "Lydia," Marcus said quietly, turning to face her. "I need you to trust me. We're going to make a run for it, but I need you to stay close. Don't stop until we're out of sight." Lydia nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. "We're not leaving you behind." "Good," Marcus said, clenching his jaw. "Stay low, stay quiet." With that, they darted from their hiding spot, weaving through the trees, moving with purpose. Every shadow seemed like a threat. Every crackle of branches underfoot felt like it would give them away. But they kept moving, driven by the adrenaline surging through their veins. They had made it about halfway to the road when the sound of tires on dirt reached their ears. Marcus froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The SUVs. They were close, too close. Suddenly, headlights pierced the darkness. The men were coming around the bend in the road, moving fast. Marcus cursed under his breath. There was no way they were going to outrun them now. Without thinking, he turned to Lydia and Rachel. "Get down," he hissed. The three of them dropped to the ground, pressing themselves into the underbrush, trying to stay as still as possible. The SUVs sped past them, the sound of the engines roaring in their ears. Marcus held his breath, praying they wouldn't be spotted. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The men in the vehicles didn't see them. They didn't hear the subtle movements of the three fugitives as they lay hidden in the darkness. The SUVs slowed and stopped a few yards away, the engines shutting off. The men dismounted, their boots hitting the ground with a sickening finality. "We know you're out here." Greg's voice rang out in the stillness. "You can't hide forever, Marcus." Marcus clenched his fists, his teeth grinding together. The time for running was over. It was time to end this. He motioned for Lydia and Rachel to stay low, then slowly, cautiously, he pulled his handgun from its holster. The cold metal felt like a weight in his hand, but it was a necessary one. He couldn't let these men take them, he wouldn't let them. A tense silence followed Greg's shout. Marcus could hear the men moving cautiously through the trees, their voices low, searching. His heart was racing, his breath shallow as he kept his eyes trained on the group. He had one shot at this. He wasn't sure how many men there were, but he knew he couldn't take them all down with just one gun. His mind raced, calculating his options. He needed to get Lydia and Rachel to safety first. Everything else came second. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind him. He whirled around, his hand tightening on the grip of his gun. It was Rachel. She had moved, just a few feet to his right. Her eyes were wide with fear as she froze, realizing the danger they were in. "Stay down." Marcus hissed, his voice harsh. Rachel immediately dropped back to the ground, but it was too late. The sound of movement in the bushes grew louder. The men had heard them, over there. One of the men shouted, pointing toward their position. It was chaos. Marcus raised his gun and fired, the shot echoing through the woods. The first man went down, a grunt of pain escaping his lips. The others returned fire almost immediately, bullets slicing through the air, grazing the trees around them. "Run!" Marcus shouted, grabbing Lydia and Rachel's arms. "Get to the road. I'll cover you." They didn't hesitate. They sprinted through the trees, their legs burning as they pushed forward. Behind them, the men gave chase, their gunshots growing louder and more desperate. Marcus fired again, aiming for another one of the men who was coming too close. The shot hit its target, but he didn't have time to watch. He was already moving, already running, catching up to Lydia and Rachel. They burst out of the woods just as the first SUV screeched to a halt in front of them. Marcus didn't hesitate. He shoved Lydia and Rachel toward the vehicle and dived into the back seat, slamming the door behind him. The car roared to life, tires spinning as they sped off down the road. The sounds of gunfire and pursuit fading into the distance, they were safe, at least for now. Marcus leaned back in the seat, his body exhausted, every nerve frayed. The battle wasn't over, but they had made it through the worst of it. And with every mile that put distance between them and the men who had hunted them, the more he realized, this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from finished, but as he looked at Lydia and Rachel, both of them still shaking, both of them still alive, Marcus knew they had made it through this far together. And no matter what came next, he would stand with them, fight for them, and never let them face the darkness alone. And there you have it, the incredible journey of how one man turned the tables on injustice, proving that no amount of prejudice or abuse of power can stand against truth and determination. From the courtroom to the streets, this story isn't just about one victory, it's about inspiring change and showing what's possible when courage meets conviction. We hope this story left you inspired, empowered, and ready to stand up for what's right. What did you think of this story? Did the ending surprise you? And what would you have done in Julian's position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more powerful tales like this one. Let's spread the message far and wide, because stories like this deserve to be told. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.